My father forced me to marry a mafia prince at the family villa, but he whispered, "I chose you years ago." I was not born for silence, but I learned to live inside it, wearing gowns chosen by men, smiling through clenched teeth, learning to fold my anger into napkins and nod at the right names. When my father told me I would marry a man I barely remembered, I didn't scream. I simply exhaled, as if some part of me had already known that women like me don't choose. We're chosen. They called it an alliance. I called it a transaction. And I boarded the car to the family villa without a suitcase, without questions. Only one name on the invitation, mine, written in my father's hand, but sealed in someone else's silence. What I didn't expect was the man waiting for me. Tall, quiet, eyes like winter surf, and the whisper that changed everything. "I chose you years ago." That was the moment I stopped breathing. Now I wonder if I was never trapped at all. If the cold I feared was always coming from inside me, and if love, the kind that waits and watches and never asks permission, was the only thing I was ever meant to surrender to. But to tell you how it ended, I need to tell you what happened in that house, by that sea, in that winter. Where silence didn't just break me, it made me listen. This story was made from the heart. If it touches yours, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And tell me in the comments, where are you in this moment? It was written in gold. Not real gold, of course. Just that kind of pressed ink that catches light when you tilt the paper. But when I touched it, it felt heavier than any metal. My name, in my father's handwriting. Flowing, final, unforgiving. Chiara Moretti. No salutation, no explanation. Just a date, a location, a seal I'd never seen before, and silence that felt louder than a scream. I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I just stood in my dressing room, in the house where every mirror had taught me not to ask questions, and I held the invitation like it was a sentence instead of a ceremony. My wedding. To a man I hadn't seen in years. A name whispered in mafia circles and luxury boardrooms. Adriano Bellini. I remembered the way the elders spoke of him, quietly, like they were afraid he might hear through the walls. I remembered one photo, years ago, passed around at some family gathering. Tall, sharply dressed, a face carved from shadow. And now, apparently, mine. No one asked me what I wanted. No one ever had. That's how the Morettis work. We don't speak. We don't resist. We wear tradition like armor and choke behind designer silk. I left Rome without a suitcase, without a phone call to anyone who might care. My mother had been buried for 6 years. My father buried something else inside me the moment she died. I think he always believed I was his to barter. And maybe I was. Maybe I am. I don't know anymore. The drive to the villa was long. Winter had taken the coast by the throat. The sky was a sheet of bruised silver, and the sea, when it appeared between trees, looked like it had secrets buried at the bottom. I pressed my forehead to the window and tried not to imagine him. Tried not to imagine my first night as someone's wife. Tried not to feel the cold curling its fingers inside my chest. The villa was perched like a crown on the cliff. Pale stone, ivy strangled by frost, windows that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. There were guards at the gates, drivers in dark coats. No music, no family, no one to greet me. Except him. He was standing at the entrance like he'd been waiting all day, maybe all year, maybe all my life. Adriano Bellini didn't smile. His face was unreadable, like a sculpture abandoned in a storm. But his eyes caught mine with a force I wasn't prepared for. I stepped out of the car and the wind hit me first, sharp and salty. He didn't speak, just watched, like he was memorizing something, or mourning it. I walked past him. I didn't say hello, didn't ask why. My heels clicked against the stone like a countdown. He followed, silent, 2 steps behind. The inside of the villa was cold. Not just temperature, it was the kind of cold that had memory, the kind that pressed into your skin and whispered that love had never lived here. My room was on the 2nd floor. It smelled like dust and dried roses. There was a dress hanging on the wardrobe door, ivory, long sleeves, laced at the throat like a noose. I stared at it for a full minute before sitting on the edge of the bed and wondering what version of myself would wake up tomorrow. Dinner was served without conversation, just the two of us, in a dining hall that could seat 20. He poured wine. I didn't drink it. He watched me eat. I barely touched the food. I felt his gaze like pressure on my skin, heavy, curious, unblinking. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to scream at him for agreeing to this, for playing his role, for being another man who saw me as something to acquire, not understand. But he didn't touch me, didn't speak to me like I was his possession. He just observed, like he was waiting for something. It was past midnight when I heard the knock. Soft, controlled. I hadn't undressed. I was still sitting in the armchair by the window, watching the waves break against the cliff like they were trying to climb it, trying to reach me. "Come in," I said, because I couldn't pretend anymore. He stepped in slowly, as if afraid his presence might break something. He didn't look at my body. He looked at my face. Only my face. Then he walked to the fireplace, stood there without speaking, and finally turned toward me. "I chose you," he said, voice low, but not hesitant. "Years ago." My breath caught, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. As if it had been the truth that lived in him for so long, he forgot it wasn't mine yet. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My chest felt hollow, my skin too tight. He took a single step closer. "You don't remember, do you?" I shook my head. I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to demand answers. But part of me, an old hidden part, was suddenly afraid of the truth. He nodded once, like he understood that fear. "You will," he whispered, "when it's time." Then he left. Just like that. No threat, no demand, no touch. And yet something inside me had shifted. Like a door I didn't know existed had creaked open behind my ribs. I sat in that silence for a long time, listening to the sea, to my heartbeat, to the echo of his voice inside my bones. I didn't know who he really was. I didn't know what he wanted from me. But I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer alone in this house. And maybe I never had been. The morning after felt unreal, like waking inside a dream that had been waiting patiently to unfold. I didn't sleep, not really. My body rested, but my mind kept replaying his voice, his words, the quiet certainty in them. "I chose you. Not I accept you. Not I will marry you. But I chose you." Past tense. As if the decision had been made long before anyone told me. As if I had no say, not because I was powerless, but because I'd already been claimed by something older than choice. I rose when the sky was still bruised with dawn. The window panes were fogged with cold, the sea gray and endless beyond them. A housekeeper brought in breakfast I couldn't eat. I sat at the small table in the corner, untouched coffee steaming beside a plate of fruit, and stared at the waves instead. Somewhere in this house was a man who said he'd chosen me. Somewhere in this house was the answer to a question I didn't know how to ask. I wandered the halls, barefoot, still in the silk robe I found in the armoire. The villa was enormous but quiet, like it had learned how to muffle footsteps and swallow sound. Paintings lined the walls, stern ancestors in oil and gold leaf. I wondered how many of them had been forced into marriages like mine, how many had learned to silence their own pulse. There were no voices, no music, just the occasional whisper of the wind through old windows and the distant breath of the sea. I passed a room with the door slightly ajar. Library, I thought, or study. And there he was, Adriano, alone. Standing by the fireplace, a folder in one hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up, wristwatch glinting in the low light. He didn't look at me immediately, but he knew I was there. I saw the shift in his shoulders, the way his fingers paused. Slowly, he turned, and when our eyes met, it felt like something fell away from me. Not protection, not resistance, just wait. "Did you sleep?" he asked, voice low and steady. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, I just didn't know what the truth was anymore. He nodded, like silence was something he understood intimately. He set the folder down, stepped away from the fire, and came closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to feel. His presence had a gravity to it, not loud, not demanding, but inescapable. "You don't have to pretend," he said, "not with me." That made something twist in my chest. I crossed my arms even though I wasn't cold. "Pretend what?" "That you don't remember anything." "I don't," I said too quickly, too sharply. He studied me, not like he was trying to prove me wrong, but like he was waiting for my memory to catch up to my body. "I know." I hated that he didn't push, hated that he gave me space instead of control. That he looked at me not like he owned me, but like he'd already seen the version of me I was still trying to hide. "Tell me," I said finally. "Tell me why." His eyes didn't flinch. "Because you were the only thing I ever wanted that didn't feel like a weapon." I blinked. "You were 11, he continued, softer now. "I was 19. My father brought me to Rome to negotiate something with yours. You were at the top of the stairs watching. You thought no one saw you. But I did." My breath hitched. A faint image flickered. Velvet stairs, a boy in a suit, the way I'd hidden behind the railing. A memory I'd buried because it felt too warm in a house that punished warmth. "You were reading something," he said. "A book you held too close to your chest, like it was a secret." I stared at him, the book coming back like a wave. A gift from my mother. A collection of poems she made me promise never to show my father. I had forgotten that day. Forgotten how I'd stared at the stranger in the foyer and thought he looked like someone from another world. "I never forgot you," he said. "Not once." And just like that, the anger I had stored like fuel began to leak through cracks I hadn't noticed. Not because I forgave him, not because I believed everything, but because no one had ever remembered me like that. Not even me. "Is this what you do?" I whispered. "Wait years to collect girls you saw once?" He didn't react. Not to the sharpness, not to the accusation. Only said, "I didn't want you like this. Arranged, cornered, but I took the chance when it came." I didn't know what to say, because part of me believed him, and that terrified me more than anything. He stepped back, as if sensing how close I was to the edge of something I didn't know how to name. "We can postpone the wedding." That stopped me. He nodded once. "You don't have to decide now." And for a moment, I wanted to scream. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to be. I was prepared to fight him, to hate him, to tear him down and walk away stronger. But what do you do when the man you're supposed to despise gives you the one thing you never had? A choice. I turned and walked away, not because I didn't want to hear more, but because I needed air. I needed distance from the truth that was starting to feel too real. The villa had a garden, or what remained of one. Ivy and marble. A fountain frozen in silence. I stood there, in the pale light of a winter morning, and let the cold bite into me. I needed the sting. I needed the reminder that I was still mine. But even in that silence, I could feel him, not watching, just waiting. The cold didn't leave my skin for hours, not even after I'd gone back inside, not even after the fire had been lit in my room. It stayed, like something woven into me, like memory or warning. I watched the flames from the edge of the bed, legs curled beneath me, hands still trembling from something I refused to name. He had offered me an out. Postpone the wedding. Let me breathe. Let me choose. And instead of relief, I felt hollow, because now there was no villain to blame, no trap to fight against. Just him, just me, and the quiet space between our truths. Lucia came to check on me in the early evening. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but her face hadn't changed. Kind eyes, soft voice. The scent of old lavender following her like a memory. She poured tea I didn't ask for, sat in the chair near the window like she belonged to the furniture, and waited for me to speak. "He said he saw me," I murmured finally, "when I was 11. She nodded once, slowly, like that didn't surprise her. "He used to come with his father, rarely, but he always asked where you were. Never spoke to you, just watched, like he was afraid to disturb something sacred." I looked at her, startled. "You knew?" Lucia met my gaze without hesitation. "I knew what I saw. I didn't know what it meant. Men like Adriano don't fall in love. They build alliances. They study weakness. They use affection like currency." She paused, sipped her tea, then added softer, "But he looked at you like a man who had nothing to gain, only something to lose." I hated how much that landed inside me, how much it mattered that someone else had seen it too. It made the edges of my resistance blur. I didn't want to be chosen as a strategy, but if it wasn't strategy, if it was something else, then I was no longer in control of what this story could become. After Lucia left, I walked the halls again. The villa had begun to shift around me, or maybe I had. The walls didn't feel quite so heavy. The silence wasn't quite so cruel. And when I found myself outside the library again, this time I didn't hesitate. He was there, just as I knew he would be. Not reading, not working, just standing, waiting, like part of him had felt me coming. He looked at me. No smile, no assumptions, just a steady, unreadable gaze. I stepped in, closed the door softly behind me. My heart was louder than my footsteps. He didn't move. I walked slowly toward him, stopping a few feet away, just enough distance to keep the illusion that I still had walls. "You remembered the book," I said. He nodded. "You remembered me." His voice was quiet. I never forgot. I should have been angry. I should have told him how selfish it was to hold on to someone in silence, to build a story without ever letting them know they were in it. But all I could feel was the strange ache of being seen. Not recently, not suddenly, but always. I took a breath. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" He looked away then, just briefly. And when he answered, his voice was rougher. "Because I didn't want to steal your life. I wanted to earn a place in it." That silenced me. Completely. He stepped closer. Not much, just enough that I could feel the heat of his body in the air between us. His presence always felt like that, like fire near skin that had forgotten warmth. "I watched your family turn you into a statue," he said. "All posture, all silence. I didn't want to be another man chiseling pieces off you. You married me." "I waited," he said, "until your father gave the offer, until I had the right to look you in the eye and tell you the truth." I stared at him, unsure where the ground had gone beneath my feet. "You think this is the truth?" He reached out slowly, his fingertips brushing the inside of my wrist. Not grabbing, just contact, a thread, a pulse. His voice dropped lower. "This is the beginning of it." I didn't pull away. Maybe I should have. But something in me was beginning to unravel. Not fall apart, but loosen. Let go. I could still feel the cold in my bones, but I no longer wanted it. I wanted something else. Something that looked suspiciously like warmth. I turned and left without a word, but not because I was retreating. I just needed space. Space to feel what I didn't yet understand. Back in my room, I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of life I could live if I wasn't always bracing for pain, if I allowed 1 inch of softness to survive. The door opened slowly. Hours later. I didn't move. I knew it was him. I could feel him. I didn't need to look. He sat on the edge of the bed, close enough to reach, far enough to respect. Neither of us spoke. Then he whispered something so quiet I almost missed it. "I still remember the way you held that book." My throat tightened. I closed my eyes, because it was safer that way. "And I remember thinking," he continued, "that if I ever touched you, I'd want to be held the same way." I exhaled, slowly, like my lungs had been waiting years for permission. Then I turned toward him, and everything changed. The dress was waiting for me like a quiet threat. Hanging on the wardrobe door, untouched, ivory silk catching the faint light from the window. I stared at it as if it might blink first. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. Deliberate. Long sleeves, high collar, lace detailing that looked almost innocent. As if someone believed wrapping a girl in softness could disguise the sharpness of her silence. I didn't move for a long time. Just stood there in my robe, the morning cold creeping under the floorboards, into my feet, up my spine. Today was the day, the wedding, the moment everything was supposed to shift from arrangement to ownership. And yet, nothing inside me felt finished. Nothing felt surrendered, except maybe the part that had already begun to open to him, slowly, like a window creaking in an abandoned room. Lucia helped me dress. Her hands were gentle but firm, like she'd done this before. Probably had. Dozens of brides, all quiet, all chosen. She didn't speak, not at first, just zipped the dress, adjusted the collar, stepped back and looked at me like I was a question she couldn't answer. "He hasn't left the chapel all morning," she said eventually. I turned toward the mirror. The girl staring back at me looked older than she had yesterday. Her eyes weren't scared. They were searching. For what? I wasn't sure. Meaning. Truth. A crack in the glass. "Did my father ever love anyone?" I asked. Lucia didn't flinch. "He loved your mother, in the way men like him are capable of love." I nodded. That was enough. More than I expected. The chapel was on the western edge of the property, small and private, built into the stone like it had always belonged there. Ivy climbed the outer walls, brittle with frost. Inside, candles flickered against dark wood and gold accents. No guests, no music. Just Adriano, standing at the altar, back straight, hands clasped in front of him. He turned when I entered. And for a moment, the world stopped moving. His eyes met mine like they always did, not with possession, but with certainty. As if every version of me, the ones I hid and the ones I didn't know yet, belonged in his gaze. There was no priest, no officiant, just him, just me, and Lucia, standing quietly at the back, as witness or guardian. I wasn't sure. He stepped forward, slowly, gently. His hand reached for mine, and I let him take it. His fingers were warm, strong, careful. "You look like a storm," he said, voice low, reverent. I wanted to laugh, or cry, or maybe both. "I feel like one." His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, that spot he always touched like it meant something. "Then let me be the sea." There were no vows, no spoken promises, just the quiet agreement that passed between us in silence. That if we were to be bound, it would not be by force, but by choice made in the absence of words, because sometimes the body speaks clearer than language ever could. He kissed my hand, not my lips, not yet, just the place where pulse meets skin, and I felt it everywhere. We left the chapel together, but something had changed. The air between us was thicker, not heavy, but charged. The villa didn't seem as cold, the walls didn't echo the same, and when we reached my room, I didn't close the door behind me. He stayed in the hallway, watching, waiting. "I don't know how to do this," I said, not looking at him. "You don't have to." "But you want me to." He didn't deny it. I turned, slowly, dress rustling against the silence. Why me, still, after all this time? He stepped forward, not quite inside the room, but close enough that I could feel his breath. "Because you never belonged to any of it. The noise, the power, the performance. You were the only thing in that house that felt alive." I swallowed. My throat burned. "I used to think no one saw me." "I did," he whispered. "Always." I reached for the clasp at the back of the dress, fumbled. He saw, crossed the threshold. His hands replaced mine, slow, careful, reverent. The dress fell, softly, like something surrendering. I stood there, still, heart racing, breath shallow. He didn't rush, didn't take. He just looked, not at my body, but at me. And when he finally touched my skin, it wasn't with hunger. It was with awe, like he couldn't believe I was real. No one had ever touched me like that. I let the silence hold us, let his hands learn me, let his mouth find the places where fear lived in my bones. He kissed me only once, gentle, unhurried. A question, not a claim. And I answered with everything I had left. After, I didn't speak. I just lay there, tangled in sheets that smelled like cedar and fire, listening to his breathing, wondering how something that was supposed to be a sentence had started to feel like the first page of something I hadn't yet written. He watched me, eyes soft, hand resting against my stomach, fingers drawing invisible lines I'd feel for hours after. "We don't have to name this," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Not yet." I nodded, eyes closed. But somewhere deep inside, something had already been named. Not love, not trust, but something older. Something mine. I woke before the light shifted. The villa was still asleep, caught in that fragile space between night and morning where everything feels slightly unreal. His body was next to mine, warm, steady, silent. I watched him breathe, his chest rising and falling beneath the blanket, one arm draped across the pillow where my head had just been. I didn't know how long I stared. Minutes, hours. Time didn't behave normally in that room, not after what we'd done, not after how he had touched me, seen me, waited for me to decide. I moved quietly, careful not to wake him, though I knew he wasn't really asleep. He didn't stir, but something in his stillness told me he was aware, choosing not to interrupt me, giving me back my solitude like a gift, not a punishment. I slipped into the robe, pulled it tight, and padded barefoot into the hallway. The cold kissed my skin like memory. The house was different now, not warmer, but less haunted. Like something had opened inside the walls. I wandered without destination, past closed doors and old portraits, until I found myself in the kitchen. A single bulb above the stove cast a soft yellow glow. The smell of coffee lingered, faint and familiar, and for a moment, I let myself pretend I lived here. Really lived here. Not as part of a deal. Not as a symbol, but as a woman with mornings, with rituals, with someone waiting for her to return to bed. I sat at the long wooden table, pulled my knees to my chest, and listened to the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of what had passed between us. Not just the physical, though my skin still remembered every place he'd touched. But the pause before the kiss. The way his breath had caught when I let the dress fall. The way he hadn't looked at my body like a conquest, but like a question he didn't dare answer too quickly. I didn't love him. Not yet. But I wasn't untouched either. Something had shifted, softened, and that scared me more than the wedding ever had. Lucia found me like that, wrapped in silence and a robe, feet cold against the tile. She didn't say anything. Just made coffee and placed it in front of me, then sat down across the table with a knowing look. "You stayed with him," she said, not as a question. I nodded. "And?" I stared into the dark surface of the coffee. It wasn't what I expected. "No," she said. "It wouldn't be." I looked up. "Did you know about him? About what he felt?" Lucia sipped her coffee. "I knew he watched. I knew he waited. But love, child, love hides itself, especially in men like him." I wanted to believe it was love, or the beginning of it. But the truth was more tangled. I didn't trust him, not entirely, not yet. But I didn't fear him either, and maybe for someone like me that was already a kind of miracle. Later I returned to my room, but he was gone. The bed still held the shape of him, the pillow faintly scented with the night. I touched the spot where he'd lain, half expecting the heat to still be there. It wasn't. I dressed slowly, deliberately. The dress today was soft cashmere, the color of storm clouds. No one had chosen it for me. No one had ordered it laid out. It was just there, like the house knew I needed something quiet to wrap around me. Downstairs, he was waiting in the library, as if he knew I'd come, as if the house itself had told him. He didn't speak right away, just watched me cross the room, take the seat across from his. The silence stretched, but not in discomfort, in anticipation. "You left early," I said. "I didn't want to make you feel owned." I nodded slowly. "You didn't." He looked at me carefully. "Then what did I make you feel?" I considered lying, or deflecting, but what would be the point? The truth was already in the room. "Seen," I said, and terrified. He didn't flinch, just leaned back slightly, as if that was exactly the answer he expected. Fear isn't always a warning, sometimes it's recognition. I blinked. Of what? Of what you've always needed, and finally found. The air between us grew heavier, not oppressive, charged. I could feel the weight of things unsaid pressing against the walls. "I don't know if I can trust you," I whispered. "You shouldn't. Not yet." That honesty disarmed me. He wasn't asking for faith. He wasn't pretending. He was giving me space to decide what this was. And I realized then that the most dangerous thing about Adriano Bellini wasn't his name. It was his patience. He would wait for me, as long as it took. And in that waiting, he would make me question every wall I'd ever built. That night I found him on the terrace. The wind was brutal, the sea beneath the cliffs raging in the dark. He was standing there without a coat, as if the cold couldn't touch him, or maybe he needed it to remind him he was alive. I stepped outside, the air slicing through my sleeves, and stood beside him. "Do you regret this?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "No." "Even if I never love you?" He turned then, slowly, eyes meeting mine in the dark. "I didn't marry you to be loved. I married you to give you a way out." I frowned. Out of what? Out of a life that made you forget who you are. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. So I reached for his hand instead. And for the first time, I felt warm. The days after the wedding unfolded like pages I wasn't ready to read. Each morning brought a strange kind of quiet, not emptiness, but something more deliberate. A quiet that waited for me to name it. Adriano was there, always there, but never in my way. He moved through the villa like someone who understood the value of space, who knew that some wounds required air, not pressure. And still, I felt him everywhere. In the hallway shadows, in the warmth of the tea left outside my door, in the softness of silence when he sat beside me, saying nothing, but holding everything. We didn't speak much about the night we shared, not because we were avoiding it, but because neither of us wanted to shrink it into words. It was safer, somehow, to let it live unspoken, like breath between us. But it changed something. Not just in me, not just in him, but in the house itself. The villa didn't seem to echo anymore. The cold wasn't as cruel. The walls didn't listen with the same suspicion. It was as if the place had been holding its breath for years, waiting for us to touch. But peace never stays long in houses like this. It began with a call I wasn't supposed to hear. I was walking past Adriano's office barefoot, holding a book I had promised myself I'd finally finish. The door was slightly ajar, his voice low, urgent, another man on speaker, words sharp and bitter, spoken too quickly. I caught one phrase, "She makes you weak." I stopped breathing. He didn't defend me. He didn't argue. He just went quiet. And that silence hurt more than anything else he could have said. I walked away before I could hear more. My heart felt too loud, my body suddenly too visible. I curled up in the reading room, book forgotten, and stared out the window at the gray sea, wondering what it meant to be a weakness. Wondering if softness always came with a price. He found me hours later, sat across from me, waited. I didn't look at him. "They think I'm a distraction," I said finally, without bitterness. "They think loving you is a liability." I turned my head slowly. "Is it?" His answer came without hesitation. Yes, that honesty should have broken me. Instead, it broke something else. The illusion that love was simple here, that it could live inside this world without bleeding. Then why not push me away? Because I'd rather be weak with you, he said, voice low, than strong without you. I hated how much that moved me. I hated that I believed him. But it wasn't just the outside pressure that pressed in. It was Sophia. She arrived 2 days later, no warning. Just a black car pulling into the courtyard, a long-legged silhouette stepping out like she belonged in the cold. She was beautiful, of course. Dark hair, sharp features, eyes that could slice through silk. She looked at me with amusement the moment we met in the hallway. "So," she said, drawing out the word, "you're the one." I didn't answer. She walked past me like a challenge, perfume trailing behind her like a weapon. And I hated that I noticed, hated that I felt smaller. I found Adriano in the study that evening. The fire was low. He was staring at the flames like they were answering questions I hadn't asked yet. "You didn't tell me she was coming." "She wasn't supposed to." "Do you still love her?" He looked at me slowly, as if surprised by the question. "No." "But you did." "Yes." I nodded, turned away, my hands trembling in the sleeves of my sweater. "She's here to test us," he said. I didn't turn back. "Are we something that can be tested?" His footsteps behind me were soft, deliberate. His arms wrapped around me from behind, slow and warm and steady. "I won't let her touch what we've built," he whispered into my hair. "But I don't even know what this is yet," I said. "How do I protect something I can't define?" His hold tightened, just slightly. "You don't have to protect it. Just don't run from it." But I wanted to. God, I wanted to. Because it's easier to run than to risk being broken again. Easier to hide behind cold walls than to step into fire willingly. That night, I dreamed of water. Not the sea, but a bath. Warm, fragrant, filled with light. And hands. His hands. Not demanding, not urgent. Just exploring, reverent. I woke up breathless. My skin ached in places he hadn't touched in days. My body remembering what my mind tried to forget. The next morning, Sophia cornered me in the garden. "You're pretty," she said. "But not dangerous." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "A prophecy." I smiled, slow and small. "Then I hope you're wrong." She blinked. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her perfect face. And I realized she wasn't here to win him back. She was here to prove to herself that he hadn't really let her go. But he had. I saw it later, in the way he looked at me across the dining table. The way his fingers found mine under the cloth, the way he smiled when I didn't pull away. Sophia left the next morning. No goodbyes, no victories, just silence. And when the car drove off, I stood by the window, feeling something like peace settle over the villa again. Not safety, but space. Space for whatever we were becoming. And maybe, just maybe, that was more powerful than anything she could take. I should have known peace couldn't last. Not here. Not in a house where every silence has layers, where every glance feels like a warning dressed in tenderness. The morning after Sophia left, I woke feeling lighter, as if her presence had been pressing on something in me I hadn't realized was strained. Adriano was beside me, still asleep, one hand curled near my hip like even in sleep he was trying to keep me close. I watched him for a long time, tracing the edge of his profile in my mind, wondering how someone so silent could carry so much noise beneath the surface. But by afternoon, that lightness began to sour. I was in the music room, a quiet place I had only recently begun to claim. I had opened the windows to let in the cold air, letting it sharpen my focus as my fingers drifted across the piano keys. I wasn't playing anything real, just sounds, fragments. I liked the way the notes hung in the air, like questions waiting for answers. Lucia came in quietly, holding an envelope. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes didn't meet mine when she handed it to me. I took it slowly, the paper thick, expensive. My name on the front. No seal. Inside a photo, a single image. Grainy, years old, but unmistakable. Me. Seated on a bench in a public square in Rome, no older than 15. Reading a book. Alone. And behind me, blurred but visible, Adriano. Watching. I couldn't breathe. Beneath the photo, in a hand I didn't recognize, a single line. You were never alone, not even when you should have been. I sat there for a long time, the photo trembling in my hand. I couldn't tell if the shake came from anger or fear or something darker, something like betrayal. When I found Adriano in the study, he was reading, or pretending to. He looked up the moment I entered, and whatever was in my face must have been loud, because he stood instantly. Where were you that day? I asked, holding the photo out. He didn't take it. He looked at me, and then he nodded. I was there. You followed me? I watched over you. That's not the same. No, he said. It's not. I stared at him, the air between us growing sharp. Why? Because your father refused to see what he was doing to you. And I couldn't interfere, but I couldn't look away either. I stepped back, the distance between us growing in ways I couldn't measure. You let me believe I was alone. You weren't. You let me think no one cared. He took a step forward, voice quieter now. I cared. I just wasn't allowed to show it. I shook my head, the photo still burned in my hand. Do you know what it did to me? Sitting on benches, walking home from school, crying in places where I thought no one could see? You let me fall apart when you were standing right there. I wasn't supposed to touch your life, he said, and there was something raw in his voice now. I wasn't supposed to even know your name, but I did, and I chose to stay in the background because I thought distance would protect you. My throat tightened. Protect me from what? From me. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. I dropped the photo onto his desk and left. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when I walked back to my room, not when I closed the door, not even when I slid to the floor and stared at the wall until the light changed. But inside, something cracked. Not a clean break, just a hairline fracture I couldn't ignore. The days that followed blurred. He gave me space, too much of it, and I hated how much I missed him in it. I saw him at meals, quiet, distant. No touches, no glances, just the echo of what we'd almost become. I started walking again, the way I used to before the villa, out along the cliff paths, where the wind was cruel and honest. I liked the way it stripped me bare. One afternoon I found a corner of the garden I hadn't seen before, a bench beneath an old olive tree. I sat there for hours, listening to nothing, waiting for clarity that wouldn't come. Lucia brought me tea. She didn't ask questions, just placed the cup beside me and sat nearby. He never stopped watching you, she said after a long silence, even when it hurt him. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it human. I looked at her, tired. What do I do with that? You decide if being seen, truly seen, is enough to forgive being unseen for so long. I wanted it to be simple. To say no, walk away, stay safe. But my heart wasn't built for simplicity. It was made for complexity, for ruin and rebuild, for aching, tender truths that don't fit inside rules. That night, I didn't sleep. And in the hours before dawn, I realized the real betrayal wasn't that he watched me suffer. It was that I let myself believe no one ever did. I didn't speak to him for 3 days, not out of anger anymore, not even pride, but because I didn't know how to put myself back together in a way that would let me face him. It was easier to drift through the villa like a ghost, to exist in the quiet spaces where I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. I ate alone, walked the garden paths until the soles of my shoes wore thin, slept in the bed that still smelled faintly of him, and hated how my body ached for something my mind could no longer claim. He didn't push. That was what made it worse. He stayed out of reach, but never out of sight. always near enough that I felt him in the air, in the way the house breathed differently when he was in the next room. But he didn't come to me. Not once. And that restraint felt like a wound I couldn't name. I wanted him to fight, to force me to see his pain, to demand I speak, scream, cry, anything. But he waited, and that waiting burned more than any confrontation ever could. On the fourth night, a storm broke. One of those thick, violent coastal storms that makes the windows tremble and the sea roar like a creature. I stood by the glass in the dark, arms wrapped around myself, and watched the waves crash against the cliffs. Lightning split the sky. Thunder followed like a second heart. And somewhere inside that noise, something in me cracked open. I left my room barefoot, hair wet from the bath, robe tied tight, but not enough to keep the chill from sinking in. The hallway was lit only by flickering sconces, the shadows shifting like breath. I knew where he would be. I didn't hesitate. He was in the study, of course, standing by the window, hands in his pockets, jaw tense. He didn't turn when I entered, but I knew he heard me. Felt me. I stood there for a moment, rain tapping the windows like fingers, the storm raging behind us. "When did you decide I wasn't worth saving?" I asked. He turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes. They were full of something I couldn't look at too long. Regret, ache, something more ancient. "I never decided that," he said. "You saw me. You watched me suffer, and you did nothing. I wasn't allowed. I didn't care what you were allowed. I needed someone." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know." I stepped closer, the floor cold beneath my feet. "Do you have any idea what it does to a girl, to believe no one is coming?" He said nothing. He didn't try to touch me, and that somehow shattered me more. "I thought I imagined you," I said, tears hot now, rising. "I thought you were a dream I made up to survive. A shadow. A kindness my mind invented." His expression broke then. Just slightly. Just enough. "You weren't a dream," he said. "You were the only real thing I ever saw." The tears spilled. I hated how they felt on my skin, hot, helpless, but I couldn't stop. "Then why didn't you come?" He crossed the room slowly, stopped a few steps from me. "Because I was afraid if I touched you then, it would be for me, not for you." I stared at him, heart breaking in places I didn't know were still whole. "And now?" "Now," he said, his voice raw. "I'd give everything to go back and make a different choice." I looked at him for a long time. The man who'd waited, the man who'd watched, the man who'd loved me from a distance so far I never knew it was love. And still, I couldn't forgive him. Not yet. So I turned and left. Not because I hated him, but because I didn't know how to love him without losing the last piece of myself I still recognized. I lay awake that night, the storm crashing outside, the bed impossibly empty, and I thought about every version of myself that had sat alone on a bench, in a stairwell, behind a door. Every girl who waited for someone who never came. Every girl who learned to be silent because even her screams felt like echoes. And I asked myself a question I'd never dared before. What if he didn't break me? What if I broke myself waiting for someone to save me instead of saving myself? That question stayed with me until morning. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, and I was ready to decide whether to fall or fly. The morning after the storm was impossibly quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace, but aftermath. I stood at the window wrapped in one of Adriano's sweaters, the sleeves long enough to cover my hands, the wool holding his scent like memory. The sea below had calmed, but not forgotten how it raged. I knew the feeling. My body felt still, but my mind hadn't stopped moving since I left him in that room, since I saw the pain in his eyes and still walked away. There's something strange about grieving the version of yourself that you were just yesterday. I could feel her slipping away, the girl who waited to be saved, who needed someone to justify her worth. She was soft, scared, obedient to silence. I loved her for surviving, but she couldn't take me any further. And so, I let her go. I spent the day in the library, not reading, just sitting, letting the room breathe around me, touching spines of books I'd never open, watching dust shift in the light like slow, graceful ghosts. Lucia brought me food, but I barely touched it. She didn't ask questions. She never did when it mattered most. Her presence was its own answer. By evening, I found myself at the edge of the terrace, barefoot, coatless, the wind biting at my skin. I let it. I wanted to feel something physical, something real. There had been too much silence, too much history muttered behind doors. I needed a sensation that didn't lie. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He didn't say my name, didn't ask if he could come closer. He just stood a few paces behind me, letting the cold curl between us. I shouldn't have stayed silent all those years, he said. I didn't turn. No, you shouldn't have. I thought I was doing the right thing. I know. Silence stretched between us, but this time, it didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge being built one breath at a time. He came closer. Not to touch me, just to be beside me. I saw you yesterday, he said, not just the woman standing in front of me. I saw the girl you were, and the pain I didn't help carry. I finally turned my head, eyes meeting his. I needed to forgive myself first, I said, for believing no one would come, for thinking my pain was invisible. He didn't speak, but I saw something shift in him. A softening. A surrender. I don't want to hate you, I whispered. It's exhausting. And I think, somewhere in me, I never really did. His eyes closed for a moment, like he was breathing in something fragile. I'll never ask you to love me, but I'll never stop hoping you might. I stepped closer, just enough that our shoulders brushed. That tiny contact lit something warm inside my chest. I don't know what this is yet, I said, but I know what it's not. It's not a lie. He turned to face me fully then, and in his eyes, I saw no victory. Just quiet reverence. A man who had waited not for power, but for permission. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing mine, not to take, just to feel. And for the first time, I didn't pull away. I laced my fingers through his, gently, deliberately. We stood there as night fell, our hands tangled in a silence that finally felt safe. Not everything had been healed, but something had begun. Not forgiveness, not yet, but truth. And maybe that was the real beginning. The days began to soften, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the smallest things. A shared glance across the table that lingered just a little longer. The way his hand would brush against mine as we passed in the hallway, not by accident, not anymore. The way I started breathing differently when he entered a room, slower, deeper, like my body recognized something my mind was still learning how to trust. He didn't try to fix anything. That was the most unexpected part. He didn't ask if I had forgiven him. Didn't ask what we were now or what I wanted from him. He simply showed up, again and again, quietly, fully, as if his presence was the only apology he knew how to give, and maybe it was enough. One morning, I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, making coffee like it was a ritual. He poured a second cup before I even asked, handed it to me without a word. Our fingers touched, and I didn't flinch. I let the warmth of the cup settle into my palms, and for the first time I smiled. He smiled back. Just a hint. But it felt like sunlight in winter. Later that day, he walked with me through the gardens. The ground was still hard with cold, but some of the trees were beginning to hint at bloom. I could feel it in the air, that quiet ache of something about to change. He didn't try to lead. Just walked beside me, letting the silence stretch and settle. We stopped near the old fountain, long dry, the stone cracked but still beautiful. He touched the rim lightly, then looked at me. I used to imagine you sitting here, he said, voice low, before I ever came back. I touched the stone too. I used to imagine someone watching, not in a haunting way, more like someone who cared enough to stay hidden. He glanced at me, something unspoken rising in his expression. I didn't know it was you, I added, but I think some part of me hoped it was. He looked away, not because he didn't want me to see his face, but because he needed a moment to breathe through what I'd just given him. That night, he knocked on my door. Not to come in, just to see if I would open it. I did. He didn't move, just stood there in the soft hallway light, hands at his sides, waiting. I can't pretend I'm whole, I said. I'm not asking for that. I still don't know if I trust you. He nodded. But you let me in. And I did. Not just into the room, but into something deeper. He came inside, slowly, respectfully. We didn't touch, not right away. He sat in the armchair. I stayed near the window. We talked for hours, about everything, about nothing. I told him about my mother's perfume. He told me about his father's silence. We traded ghosts. At some point, I leaned my head against the glass and said, I don't want to be angry anymore, but I'm scared that if I stop, I won't know who I am without it. He stood then, came close, not to take, but to offer. His fingers brushed my hair behind my ear, gentle, hesitant. You're not your anger, he said. You're the voice underneath it. That night, we didn't make love. We didn't undress. We just lay in bed, fully clothed, his arm beneath my head, my hand resting over his heart. It beat like a secret, steady, patient. And I thought, this is what healing sounds like. Not a shout, not even a sigh, just breath. Shared, trusted, close. I wasn't whole yet, but I wasn't alone anymore. And that was enough to begin again. The days began to soften, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the smallest things. A shared glance across the table that lingered just a little longer, the way his hand would brush against mine as we passed in the hallway, not by accident, not anymore. The way I started breathing differently when he entered a room, slower, deeper, like my body recognized something my mind was still learning how to trust. He didn't try to fix anything. That was the most unexpected part. He didn't ask if I had forgiven him. Didn't ask what we were now, or what I wanted from him. He simply showed up, again and again, quietly, fully, as if his presence was the only apology he knew how to give. And maybe it was enough. One morning, I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, making coffee like it was a ritual. He poured a second cup before I even asked. Handed it to me without a word. Our fingers touched, and I didn't flinch. I let the warmth of the cup settle into my palms, and for the first time, I smiled. He smiled back, just a hint, but it felt like sunlight in winter. Later that day, he walked with me through the gardens. The ground was still hard with cold, but some of the trees were beginning to hint at bloom. I could feel it in the air, that quiet ache of something about to change. He didn't try to lead, just walked beside me, letting the silence stretch and settle. We stopped near the old fountain, long dry, the stone cracked but still beautiful. He touched the rim lightly, then looked at me. I used to imagine you sitting here, he said, voice low, before I ever came back. I touched the stone too. I used to imagine someone watching, not in a haunting way, more like someone who cared enough to stay hidden. He glanced at me, something unspoken rising in his expression. I didn't know it was you, I added, but I think some part of me hoped it was. He looked away, not because he didn't want me to see his face, but because he needed a moment to breathe through what I'd just given him. That night, he knocked on my door, not to come in, just to see if I would open it. I did. He didn't move, just stood there in the soft hallway light, hands at his sides, waiting. I can't pretend I'm whole, I said. I'm not asking for that. I still don't know if I trust you. He nodded. But you let me in. And I did. Not just into the room, but into something deeper. He came inside, slowly, respectfully. We didn't touch, not right away. He sat in the armchair. I stayed near the window. We talked for hours, about everything, about nothing. I told him about my mother's perfume. He told me about his father's silence. We traded ghosts. At some point, I leaned my head against the glass and said, I don't want to be angry anymore, but I'm scared that if I stop, I won't know who I am without it. He stood then, came close. Not to take, but to offer. His fingers brushed my hair behind my ear, gentle, hesitant. You're not your anger, he said. You're the voice underneath it. That night, we didn't make love. We didn't undress. We just lay in bed, fully clothed, his arm beneath my head, my hand resting over his heart. It beat like a secret, steady, patient. And I thought, this is what healing sounds like. Not a shout, not even a sigh, just breath, shared, trusted, close. I wasn't whole yet, but I wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough to begin again. The world didn't change. The sea still rose and fell with its own rhythm, unmoved by the fact that my heart had finally stilled. The villa still stood quiet on its cliff, old stone and ivy and stories hidden in the walls. Nothing around me transformed into something new. But I had. And that made everything look different. I woke in his arms and didn't reach for the past. I didn't wonder what this meant or how long it would last. I just listened to his breathing, warm and steady, and let myself believe that peace could be quiet, that it didn't have to be earned with pain or chased like a promise always out of reach. We spent that morning in silence. Not the tense silence we'd once shared, but something softer. We touched without need, spoke with our eyes. He watched me like I was still unfolding, and I let him, because I no longer needed to hide the woman I was becoming. Later, I walked through the house with bare feet and loose hair, greeting rooms I had once avoided. They didn't scare me anymore. The ghosts here didn't belong to me. I had my own now, and they weren't haunting. They were lessons, woven into every breath. Lucia found me in the solarium, where sunlight poured through glass like blessing. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, her gaze full of something quiet and proud. You look different, she said softly. I feel different. Because of him, because of me. She smiled then, the kind of smile that says she'd been waiting for me to say those words all along. I found Adriano on the back terrace, his coat draped over one arm, his gaze fixed on the sea. He turned when he heard me, and for the first time, I didn't brace for impact. I walked straight into his arms and pressed my face to his chest like I belonged there. He kissed the top of my head. You're quiet today. I'm listening. To what? Myself, for once. We stood there for a long time, the wind moving through us, the world undemanding. I want to stay, I said. Not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid. But because this... I touched his chest. Feels like something I chose. He didn't answer right away. Just kissed my hand. Held it like it was sacred. I'm not perfect, he said. I'm not asking you to be. He nodded. Then stay. And I did. Not as a bride in a gilded cage. Not as a daughter playing a role. But as a woman who had walked through silence and made something beautiful out of the wreckage. That evening, we dined together for the first time without a shadow in the room. Just candlelight, wine, his fingers brushing mine across linen. He watched me like he was still learning me, and I let him. I'd let him keep learning for as long as he wanted, because I wasn't finished either. I was still unfolding, still softening, still stepping into the kind of love that didn't demand surrender, but invited it. After dinner, we walked the halls side by side, and when we passed the old mirror near the staircase, I saw us reflected together for the first time. Not as strangers, not as a transaction, but as something whole. The house still held its silence, but now it was a silence I could live inside, because I was no longer afraid of the sound of my own voice. And he never needed to raise his to be heard. I am not the woman who came here believing herself sold. I am not the girl on the bench waiting for someone who never came. I am the woman who stayed, the woman who was seen, and now the woman who chose. The days began to carry a different weight. Not heavy, not difficult, just full. Full of quiet routines that wrapped around me like warmth. Full of glances across sunlit rooms that made me feel known in ways I hadn't thought possible. I started waking before him, not to escape, but to watch him sleep. There was something about his face in that stillness. Unguarded, almost boyish, as if time had softened him in sleep the way love was beginning to soften him in life. I would slip out of bed and walk barefoot through the villa, the cold floors no longer startling. The house had become mine in small, secret ways. A coffee cup I always reached for. A chair I curled into when it rained. The rhythm of his footsteps behind me, never chasing, only following close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. We didn't speak about the past much anymore. Not because we were avoiding it, but because we had made peace with it. It lived in us, yes, but no longer ruled us. It became a foundation, not a prison. And that shift, slow, quiet, earned, was what I cherished most. One morning, he found me in the garden, kneeling by a patch of earth where I'd begun planting lavender. My hands were dirty, hair tied in a loose knot, and I looked up expecting surprise or amusement. Instead, he knelt beside me, reached for the soil, and asked, "Where do you want me to dig?" It was a small moment, but it cracked something open inside me. Because love, I was learning, isn't about the grand gestures. It's about that. A man in a black cashmere coat on his knees, hands in the earth, digging beside you because you didn't ask, but he came anyway. That night, I lit candles in the bedroom without thinking. There was no occasion, no need. I just wanted the glow, the warmth. I lay in bed with a book in my hands and his voice murmuring something soft in Italian as he undressed by the hearth. I didn't understand the words, not all of them, but the sound wrapped around me like silk. He joined me under the blanket, one arm under my head, his body curved along mine. We didn't speak. He kissed my shoulder once, just below the collarbone, and I let the book fall from my hands. We didn't make love that night. We simply held each other, and somehow that was more intimate than anything else we'd done. There were days when shadows still returned, memories that knocked softly, uninvited. I would go quiet, still. He would wait. Sometimes he'd take my hand. Sometimes he'd walk away and return with tea. But he never pushed, never demanded light where I was still learning how to let it in. I trusted that. I trusted him. And that trust made room for something I hadn't felt in years. Joy. The unremarkable kind. The kind that lives in the smell of fresh bread, in the warmth of towels left by the bath, in the way his eyes always found mine across a crowded room, even when the room was just us. It wasn't perfect. It was better, because it was real. And every morning I woke beside him. I chose it again. Not with words, but with breath, presence, quiet surrender. The kind of love you don't announce, the kind you live. Something changed in the way my body moved through the days. I noticed it first in the mornings, how I lingered in bed a little longer, not from laziness but from something softer. A sense that time was slowing down around me, that the rush I once lived inside had surrendered to stillness. I moved slower, breathed deeper, touched more deliberately. The world wasn't asking anything of me, and for the first time, I wasn't asking anything of it. Adriano noticed before I did. He watched me across the breakfast table one morning, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, eyes narrowed with something tender and curious. "You're quieter lately," he said. I looked up from the slice of pear I hadn't touched. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said with a faint smile. "It's a sign." "Of what?" He didn't answer, just reached for my hand and kissed the inside of my wrist, slowly, like the truth might be hiding there. Later that day, I sat in the sunroom with a blanket over my legs and a book in my lap I hadn't managed to read. The pages blurred, and I found myself pressing a hand against my belly without meaning to. Just a light touch, a grounding one. I didn't know yet, not with certainty, but something in me had already shifted. Lucia came in quietly, bringing fresh linens, and paused when she saw me like that. She didn't speak, just gave me a look, that soft, old-world wisdom in her eyes. She knew. That evening, I told Adriano without ceremony, without fear. We were lying in bed, our limbs tangled beneath the blanket, the window open to the hush of waves below. I turned to him, my hand resting lightly on my stomach. I think I might be pregnant. He stilled, not tense, just entirely, profoundly present. Then he cupped my face with both hands, eyes searching mine. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "No," I said. "Not anymore." His mouth found mine, slow, reverent, almost reverent with restraint. And then, as his lips moved to my cheek, my neck, he whispered, "You've always carried more than you knew." The days that followed became a new kind of quiet, a waiting that wasn't anxious, but sacred. We didn't rush to confirm anything. We let the knowing rise slowly, like light through fog. He brought me tea before I could ask. I rested without guilt. We read poetry aloud in the afternoons, letting the words fill the spaces between our heartbeats. I had been so many women before this: daughter, bride, ghost, flame. Now I was becoming something else. Not just a lover, not just a wife, but a vessel, a beginning. And in his touch, in his gaze, in the way he traced circles on the small of my back without a word, I knew he felt it too. Not just the child, but the new world we were building, quietly, together. I began to notice the smallest things, how the light shifted differently through the windows in the late afternoon, how my breath seemed to echo louder inside my body, how the walls of the villa no longer felt like stone, but skin. My own skin had changed too, softer, more alert, like it was learning to listen from the inside out. Every sound, every movement, every word he spoke touched me differently now. I didn't rush to confirm what I already knew. My body was speaking to me in a language I didn't want translated by tests or numbers. I trusted it. I trusted the flutter beneath my ribs when I woke, the way my appetite turned gently away from certain foods, the tender ache in my breasts when he kissed my collarbone. I trusted the sudden stillness that would fall over me like a hush, as if everything inside was holding its breath, listening for a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Adriano adjusted without words. He started walking slower beside me, holding my elbow like I might stumble, though I never did. He placed his hand on my lower back when we moved through doorways, his touch instinctual, protective. At first I thought he was doing it without knowing, but then I saw the way he watched me. Not with worry, but reverence. As if I were already carrying something sacred, and I was. One morning, I caught my reflection in the tall mirror by the staircase and didn't look away. My hair was unbrushed, my skin bare, but there was a softness in my eyes I hadn't seen before. A quiet that came not from emptiness, but from fullness. I touched my stomach lightly, barely pressing, and whispered something I didn't even realize I believed. "I'm ready." That night he ran me a bath. The lights were low, candles flickering along the marble edge. He didn't speak as he helped me undress. His hands were slow, deliberate, not erotic, devotional. He eased me into the warm water, knelt beside the tub, and kissed my wrist, then my palm, then each fingertip. I closed my eyes. Let the heat loosen everything inside me. Let the stillness stretch into something sacred. "I've been thinking," he said, voice barely louder than the water. I opened my eyes, met his. "If it's a girl," he said, "I'd like to name her after your mother." My breath caught, not because I hadn't thought of it, but because I had, and hadn't dared to say it out loud. "Lucia," I whispered. He nodded. "It suits her already." My throat tightened. He leaned in, kissed my temple, and stayed there, not moving, just breathing with me. That night, as we lay in bed, his hand resting gently over my belly, I listened to the rhythm of the sea outside and the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek, and I realized that something had shifted permanently. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't searching. I wasn't surviving. I was becoming. Not alone, but with him, with her, with the version of me I had always hoped might one day be possible. Not perfect, just present, alive, real, and finally, at peace. There are kinds of desire that arrive like thunder, loud, fast, impossible to ignore. Ours didn't feel like that anymore. It moved slowly now, like light across skin, like breath warming a sleeping body. It didn't burn. It shimmered. It knew me. Not just the surface of me, but the part that curled inwards and whispered secrets only silence could hear. My body was changing, gently, quietly. I felt it in the way my skin stretched in new directions, in the sudden tenderness of my hips, in how his gaze lingered longer on my stomach, even before it began to show. I caught him watching me one morning as I dressed in front of the open window, his shirt draped over my shoulders, my legs bare. There was reverence in his eyes, but something more, something closer to ache. He didn't come to me with urgency. He never did. He came like a question, always asking with his hands, with his mouth, with the way he undressed me like I might break, but also like I might save him. That night, he touched me with a slowness that made my chest ache. Fingers down the side of my waist, mouth at the curve of my shoulder, his breath steady against my throat. I felt myself open, not just in body, but in heart, in memory, in everything I had once held tight inside my ribs. I let him see all of it. He kissed me like I was already a mother, like I was already his home. His hands moved with purpose, not need. His mouth was a map, tracing everywhere I'd buried longing. When he entered me, I cried, not from pain, but from something softer. A grief that wasn't sadness, a joy too full for silence. We moved in rhythm, not to reach some climax, but to remember who we were beneath the names, the history, the vows. I curled around him like breath returning to lungs, and when it ended, I didn't let go. I held him. He held me. For a long time, we didn't speak. He rested his hand on my belly, fingers spreading over skin that had begun to feel like sacred ground. "Thank you," he whispered. I turned to face him, eyes half closed, voice raw. "For what?" "For not giving up. On yourself. On me. On us." I kissed his chest, just above his heart. "You waited," I said. "So did I." And in that silence, our bodies tangled, the night curling around us like a promise, I felt something I hadn't known I was still missing. I felt safe. Not just here, but in him. In me. In us. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of day that begins without warning, clouds too still, air too quiet. I remember the way the silver light fell across the stone floors, how Adriano kissed my shoulder before leaving for the meeting he said would be short, how I lingered in the doorway longer than usual, watching him walk toward the car, one hand in his pocket, the other lifting in that subtle wave he only gave me. I felt it before I heard it. A shift in the rhythm of the house. Lucia's voice whispering too quickly in the hallway, the soft thud of someone running down the back stairs. My chest tightened without instruction. My body already knew what my mind refused to say out loud. Something had happened. I moved toward the front doors as if pulled. No one stopped me. That silence, too, was a warning. The car didn't return. Not when it should have. Not when the clock said it was time. I paced the corridor, then stopped myself, hand pressing to my stomach, breathing slow, deliberate. I wouldn't panic. I couldn't. Not now. When the call came, it wasn't his voice. It was Marco's. "He's alive," he said first, and I nearly collapsed with the force of that single sentence. Then, "But he's hurt." I didn't ask how. I didn't want the details. Just the destination. The car was waiting before I even turned to dress. The ride to the hospital blurred. Roads unspooling like ribbon, the world outside the window a dull, frozen smear. I kept one hand on my belly the entire time, as if protecting something fragile from a grief that hadn't arrived but threatened to. When I entered the hospital room, he was already awake, bandaged, pale, hooked to machines, but alive, alive. I stood in the doorway for a moment, breath caught somewhere between ribs and throat. He looked up. His eyes met mine, and for a second, everything inside me collapsed and rebuilt in the same breath. He whispered my name like prayer. I crossed the room slowly, climbed into the bed without asking, careful not to disturb the IV, and rested my head on his chest. His arm came around me, weak but certain. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. His heart was still beating, and that was enough. For now. I cried later, alone in the corridor outside. Not because I'd been strong for him, but because my body had held the fear too long. I let it out in silence, tears soaking into the sleeve of my coat, my palm pressed to the cool hospital wall. I had almost lost him. And in those hours of not knowing, something inside me had crystallized. I couldn't lose him. Not now. Not ever. Not when love had finally become something real in my hands. When I returned to his room, he was asleep. I sat beside him, held his fingers in mine, and whispered to the quiet hum of machines. I'm not going anywhere. And I meant it. With every cell of my changing body, with every piece of the woman I had become. He opened his eyes slowly, like someone returning from a far place. The light in the room was soft, filtered through the pale curtains drawn against the winter morning. I had been watching him sleep for hours, counting each breath, listening to the rhythm of the monitors, memorizing the shape of his stillness. When his gaze finally met mine, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes filled with something that broke me open and held me at the same time. I reached for his hand, wrapped my fingers gently around his. It was warm, solid, real. I'm here, I said, voice low, steady. He blinked slowly, his lips parting as if to speak, but all that came was breath, and that was enough. The sound of it, the presence of it, I had feared I would never hear it again. You don't have to say anything, I whispered. You just have to stay. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, soft and tired, but full of life, full of him. I leaned forward, pressed my lips to his forehead. His skin was cool and clean, carrying the scent of antiseptic and something more fragile, something like survival. You scared me, I said, the words barely audible. More than I thought was possible. His fingers moved, tightening just slightly around mine. I closed my eyes and let that small pressure fill me. You don't have to be strong right now, I said. I'll be strong for both of us. He nodded slowly, and I could see the relief settle into his body. The way his chest sank just a little deeper into the bed. The way his hand didn't let go of mine. A nurse came in quietly, checked the machines, adjusted something I didn't understand. She smiled at me with that knowing expression, the one women give each other in moments that need no explanation. I nodded back. When we were alone again, I sat back in the chair beside him, still holding his hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest. There was nothing dramatic in that moment, no sudden revelation, no grand declarations, just breath, just presence, just the quiet power of a love that had learned to stay. Later, when he slept again, I pulled the chair closer, rested my head beside his arm, and let my body finally relax. I stayed like that for hours, and when the nurse offered to bring me a blanket, I shook my head. I have everything I need right here. Because I did. I had him, still breathing, still mine. And that was enough to begin again. The villa greeted him like it had been holding its breath. The front doors opened wide, the old stone warmed by sun, the garden touched with early spring light. He walked slowly, still healing, but with his usual quiet grace. I stayed close, not out of fear, but habit. The kind that comes from loving someone you almost lost. My hand hovered near his back, not touching, just ready. He didn't need help, but he let me follow him anyway. Inside, the silence had changed. It wasn't the cold hush of waiting. It was peace, the kind that settles after a storm, when nothing needs to be explained anymore. The rooms looked softer somehow. The curtains moved gently in the breeze. Even the floor beneath my feet felt less like stone, more like memory. He walked to the piano room first, stood at the threshold. I watched him run his fingers along the edge of the instrument without playing. Then he sat, lifted the lid, and let his hands find the keys. Not a song, just sound. Soft, incomplete, but beautiful. I leaned against the doorframe and closed my eyes. Let the notes drift over me like morning wind. In the kitchen, he made coffee. Slowly, carefully. I sat at the table, watching the curve of his movements, the way he still favored his left side. He set the cup in front of me and didn't say anything, just smiled, and I smiled back. We didn't need to fill the air anymore. Our quiet had become a language. We ate lunch by the window. He cut the bread. I sliced the pears. He poured wine for himself, water for me, touching my hand briefly as he set the glass down. I saw the gratitude in his eyes, not just for this moment, but for everything I had carried while he couldn't. The hours by the hospital bed. The nights I whispered love into his skin while he slept. The fear I swallowed so he wouldn't have to taste it. That afternoon, we walked through the garden hand in hand. The wind played with the edges of my dress. The lavender I had planted was beginning to bloom. He stopped beside it, knelt, and pressed his fingers into the earth. "She'll love this," he said. I looked at him. "She?" He nodded. "I can feel her. Somehow." I smiled, placed my hand over his heart. "So can I." Later, we danced in the drawing room. No music, just the sound of the sea outside and the rustle of our bodies moving slowly, rhythmically, like a tide. His hand on my back, mine on his shoulder, my cheek against his neck. I felt the thrum of his pulse. Strong, alive, and knew I would never take it for granted again. That night, we made love with the windows open. The moonlight touched our skin like it had been waiting for this. There was no urgency, no ache, just reverence. His body moved with mine like it had always known me, and when I cried, it wasn't from pain or fear. It was from fullness. After, we lay tangled in sheets that smelled of salt and skin. He whispered something into my hair. I didn't catch the words. I didn't need to. His breath said enough. I watched him fall asleep. The room dim, the wind quiet, and I realized the house had finally become a home. Not because it was beautiful, but because we were in it, together, alive, in love. The morning light was different, softer, slower, like it knew this day was meant to be remembered. I stood at the window wrapped in one of Adriano's sweaters, my hands resting gently on the curve of my belly, now unmistakably full. The sea moved quietly below, its rhythm no longer something I feared, but something I belonged to. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was simply here. He came up behind me without a sound. I felt his breath before I felt his hands. One slid around my waist, the other settled on top of mine. We stood like that, our bodies pressed into stillness, watching the world unfold without rush. His lips brushed my shoulder, warm and slow. "She's moving," I whispered. He smiled against my skin. "She always wakes when you do." I turned to face him. His hair still tousled from sleep, eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. He looked at me like I was made of something ancient and holy. I touched his face, traced the scar near his temple with my thumb, the one I'd kissed a dozen times since he came home. "We're ready," I said. "For her?" he asked. "For all of it." The day passed in rhythms, lavender tea, sunlight on stone, the sound of distant birds. I walked through the villa barefoot, trailing my fingers along walls that once felt like boundaries, but now felt like pages. Every step, a sentence I had written with my own breath. In the nursery, everything was quiet. The crib hadn't arrived yet. The walls were bare, but I stood in the center of the room and felt no lack. My child didn't need perfection. She needed presence, and she would have it, all of it, from both of us. Adriano watched me from the doorway. I dreamed of this before I ever knew your name, he said. I smiled. I dreamed of being chosen. He crossed the room and took my hands. You weren't chosen, he said. You were the choice. I kissed him then, slow and deep, my fingers threading through his hair. There was no need to say anything else. That evening, we sat on the terrace wrapped in blankets, the stars above us like old friends. My head rested on his shoulder, his hand on my stomach. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to prove. No more ghosts to silence, just breath, and the life growing quietly between us. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a guest inside my own body, or my story. I was home, fully, finally, completely mine. She smells like salt and milk and something I can't name, a scent so new and familiar at the same time, it makes my chest ache every time I breathe her in. I carry her close, tucked against me in a soft wrap, her tiny face turned inward, her breath warm against my skin. She sleeps more deeply when we walk. The rhythm of my body, the sway of each step, lulls her into a peace I never knew I could give. We move slowly through the villa, bare feet on cool stone, morning light spilling through arched windows like a blessing. She doesn't make a sound, only the faintest sigh now and then, like she's dreaming of something she hasn't yet seen. Outside, the sea is calm. The wind is gentle. I walk with her down the path through the garden, where lavender has bloomed again, fuller this time, as if it knows she's here. The sky is soft and silver, the way it only gets this close to spring, and I realize I don't miss the silence anymore. Not the silence of waiting, of grief, of not being seen. This silence is different. It's full of presence. Adriano watches us from the terrace, arms folded, a slow smile on his face. He doesn't speak, just watches. I think he could do that forever, just stand there and memorize the shape of us, like he still can't believe we're real. I sit with her on the edge of the fountain, the one he repaired while I was resting after the birth. She stirs slightly, her fingers curling against my chest. I kiss her forehead, that impossibly soft patch of skin that smells like the beginning of everything, and I close my eyes. I think of the girl I was, the one who sat alone on benches, who walked home through shadowed streets believing no one was watching, who thought her silence was invisible. I think of the woman who stood at the altar believing she was being traded, and I think of the night he whispered, "I chose you years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago." Because it was. This life, the one with her in my arms, and him watching from the place we now call home, this is the life that chose me back. She stretches just a little, her mouth forming a silent yawn, and I cradle her closer. Her skin is warm, her heart, impossibly small and steady, beats right beneath mine. "You're safe," I whisper. "You're seen. You're loved." She won't remember this moment, but I will. I will carry it in my bones, because this is everything I never thought I'd have, and everything I will never let go. It was tucked inside the drawer of his nightstand, beneath a folded handkerchief and a watch he no longer wore. I hadn't been looking for anything, just rearranging things, making room for the tiny growing evidence of a new life that filled every corner of our home. But there it was, an envelope with my name on it, my full name, in his handwriting, not the name he whispers at night, not the name he speaks when no one is listening. The name he first saw written on a file, a contract, a destiny neither of us fully understood yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, held the letter in my hands, felt its weight. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. Not old, but not new. I didn't open it right away. I pressed it to my chest. I closed my eyes. I listened to the rhythm of the sea through the open window, the sound of my daughter breathing in the next room. The house was still, the air warm, and my heart steady. Then I unfolded it. "Kiara, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to give it to you. But I need to write these words, even if only to get them out of the quiet places inside me. I saw you before I knew your name. a girl at the top of a staircase holding a book like a secret. You looked down at a room full of men and saw nothing you wanted. You looked at me like I didn't exist. And maybe I didn't, not to you. But you became the only real thing in the room. I watched you grow from a distance I hated. I knew your routines, the way you folded into yourself in public, the way your eyes changed when you thought no one was watching. I watched you grieve in silence, and I carried that grief like a weight I wasn't allowed to name. When your father offered your name, I took it. Not because I wanted a wife, not because I wanted power, but because I couldn't live knowing someone else might get to love you first. I didn't come to save you. I came because I needed to be near the only thing that ever made me feel human. If you hate me now, I understand. If you never forgive me, I deserve that. But I needed you to know. This wasn't about business, or legacy, or duty. It was always about you. I chose you when I had nothing to offer. I choose you now, knowing what I might lose. And I will keep choosing you, even if the only place I exist for you is on this page. A. I sat in silence for a long time, the letter resting in my lap, my fingers curled loosely around the edges. I read it again. Then a third time, each word soaking deeper, each line settling into the marrow of me like a truth I'd always known but needed to hear aloud. He had never meant for me to find this, but I was glad I had. Because now I knew, long before the wedding, long before the first kiss, long before I realized I was his. I had already been loved, not in secret, but in silence. And sometimes, that's louder than anything else. I folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside my own journal. Then I walked to the nursery and stood by the crib, watching her sleep. Her tiny fists curled near her face, her breath soft and sure. I leaned down and whispered to her, voice barely louder than a heartbeat. Your father loved us before we ever knew how to love ourselves. And in that quiet, in that room filled with lavender and morning light, I felt the story close. Not with an ending, but with something better. A beginning that had been waiting for us all along.